In a luxurious office that once shone with prestige but now felt painfully empty, high above downtown Chicago, silence reigned. The spacious penthouse had long symbolized the success of Richard Hayes, one of the Midwest's most influential real estate magnates. But today, there were no assistants rushing about, no partners calling with new deals. Only pale daylight slipping through the floor-to-ceiling windows, and a weary man sitting in a massive leather chair. Richard turned a court summons over in his hands. Fabricated corruption charges had crushed the empire he had been building for 20 years, sacrificing time, health, and, as he now realized, moral clarity. For weeks, his name had been associated only with scandal. Former colleagues distanced themselves. And the night before, the last person he trusted had vanished. His attorney, Alan Green, fled and left behind a brief note, "I'm sorry. The pressure is too strong. I can't fight them." Richard reread it at least 20 times, unable to decide whether Green had betrayed him or simply saved his own life. The next morning, the courtroom greeted Richard with the sharp whispers of reporters and the cold stare of Prosecutor Johnson, a man with a flawless public image and a merciless reputation. Richard felt like a trapped animal. Without an attorney, he knew they would tear him apart. Judge Davis tapped his gavel impatiently, preparing to begin the hearing, when the doors creaked softly. Everyone turned. A tiny figure stood in the doorway, a girl no more than 5 or 6. She wore an old oversized coat, its sleeves nearly touched the floor. Her light hair was tied haphazardly, and her enormous blue eyes looked so serious that the courtroom fell silent. "Young lady, you cannot be here," the bailiff said sternly, stepping toward her. But the girl raised her small hand with unexpected authority. "I am here on business," she said calmly. And, bypassing the startled bailiff, she walked straight to the defense table. Judge Davis's surprise deepened into shock when the girl neatly placed a formal legal motion on the table. "My name is Emily Smith, and I will represent Mr. Hayes," she declared with such determination that several people in the room gasped. She cited a rare clause in criminal law that, indeed, did not specify any minimum age for a defense representative as long as the person possessed sufficient legal knowledge. The motion was formatted perfectly. Signatures, citations, precedents. Everything was immaculate. Prosecutor Johnson suddenly paled. Emily Smith. The name had appeared in the news 2 years earlier. Daughter of Judge Smith, the honest, principled man who investigated a massive corruption scheme tied to the demolition of Chicago's historic districts. A scheme involving influential officials and businessmen. Judge Smith had died suddenly, officially due to an accident. But in the courtroom, the little girl said clearly, "My father did not die in an accident." She pulled a worn folder from her bag. On the cover were her father's initials. Inside were documents he had collected until his final day, not only detailed evidence of the corruption scheme and money laundering through the city project, but also undeniable proof that Prosecutor Johnson himself was one of the central conspirators. According to Judge Smith's notes, Johnson orchestrated the case against Hayes after the businessman refused to participate in the illegal project. A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Davis silently studied the documents for several long minutes. Then he abruptly rose to his feet. "The court will take an emergency recess. We must contact federal authorities immediately." While the courtroom buzzed with confusion, Richard looked at the small girl beside him. For the first time in many years, he witnessed true courage. Not the kind that builds skyscrapers or negotiates billion-dollar deals, but the courage to stand against an entire system armed with nothing but determination and an old worn coat. An hour later, the hearing resumed. Before the stunned audience, federal agents arrested Prosecutor Johnson right at the prosecution table. All charges against Richard Hayes were dismissed. Richard could hardly process that he was free. The realization that he had been saved by a little orphan who studied law at night in order to clear her father's name struck him deeply. Within a month, a new symbol of hope appeared in Chicago, the Judge Smith Civil Rights Protection Foundation. Richard Hayes became its financial backbone, and little Emily, now dressed in proper clothes but still carrying that unwavering gaze, became its unofficial coordinator, its mind, heart, and moral compass. Their work had only just begun. They were determined to expose corrupt officials, restore integrity to the justice system, and bring trust back to the people. and the fallen empire of Richard Hayes was slowly transforming into a fortress dedicated to fighting the very corruption that had nearly destroyed them both. The opening of the Judge Smith Civil Rights Protection Foundation became a turning point not only for Richard Hayes and little Emily, but for the entire city of Chicago. Within weeks, people began coming to the foundation's modest but energetic office, victims of officials, whistleblowers afraid for their lives, families whose cases were buried in dusty archives. Emily, despite her age, had an uncanny ability to see what adults overlooked. She read documents faster than most paralegals. She spotted inconsistencies in witness statements. She remembered tiny details that seemed irrelevant to others but later revealed crucial mysteries. It was as if her father's brilliant legal mind lived on inside her, but sharpened by hardships no child should ever endure. Richard, meanwhile, was changing too. The former tycoon who once negotiated from private jets now spent his days among boxes of old case files, drinking cheap coffee with investigators and taking notes. He rarely spoke of his past wealth. The shine of luxury had faded. The only shine he cared about now was the one he saw in Emily's determined eyes. But their growing success attracted attention, the kind they did not want. Late one evening, when the office had emptied and only Emily and Richard remained, sorting through another batch of dusty folders, the lights suddenly flickered. A shadow moved behind the frosted glass door. Richard instinctively stepped in front of Emily. The door opened. A tall man in a dark coat entered, Agent Marcus Reed from the federal task force that had arrested Johnson. His face was serious. "You've stirred up a hornet's nest," he said without greeting. Johnson wasn't acting alone. He was only one hand of a much larger machine. Powerful people, deeply rooted. "They've been watching you. And they're not pleased." Emily didn't flinch. "So what?" she asked. "They're afraid we'll find the truth." Reed stared at her, astonished, not by her words, but by her fearless tone. "Yes," he finally admitted. "And they'll try to stop you." Richard's heart tightened. "Are you saying we're in danger?" The agent lowered his voice. "You both need protection. Especially the girl." Emily straightened up. "I'm not running," she said quietly. "They took my dad. I'm not letting them take anyone else." Her words hit Richard like a blow. His chest tightened, part fear, part admiration. She was just a child, yet she carried herself like someone forged by storms. Reed handed Richard a sealed envelope. "This is everything we've gathered so far. Names, connections, missing files, assassinations disguised as accidents. But there's one thing you need to understand." He paused. This conspiracy didn't start with Johnson. And it didn't end with his arrest. Emily gently tugged Richard's sleeve. "Open it," she whispered. Richard broke the seal. Inside were photos, documents, handwritten notes, and at the very bottom, a picture that made the blood drain from his face. It was his own photograph, taken secretly. Recently. Emily leaned closer, her eyes widening. "They're watching you," she murmured. "And me." Reed nodded. "That's why I came. You two are stepping into a war." Silence hung in the room like thick fog. But then Emily did something unexpected. She picked up the photo, ripped it cleanly in half, and dropped it on the table. "We're not afraid," she said. "And we're not stopping." Richard looked at her, this small, determined child who had already seen more darkness than most adults. No, they would not stop. The empire he once built from steel and glass was gone. But a new one, built on truth and justice, was rising from its ashes. And this time, he wasn't building it alone.